Do you want to mention Eliza Dushku also? Since that's So I'll... Welcome. We'll get started. If I can ask everyone to please find a seat. You can sit on the stairs if you need to, and if you're reserving a seat for a friend, you may want to give up now, actually. Your friend probably won't find you, so someone could take that seat in the meantime. We'll try to get everyone into this room rather than to have overflow in Hall D, where the atmosphere isn't quite the same. We do have more syllabi available, and afterwards you can pick one up if you didn't get one. Our syllabus is also available on the course website as a Word document and as a PDF file. And we will begin today with a number of announcements before we introduce today's guest.
Eliza Dushku, star of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, will be visiting our course on April 19th. That's a date to add to your syllabi. We also want to remind you about electronic sectioning. If you want to be in a section, you need to sign up for sectioning online on Wednesday or Thursday. To do this, you go to the web links on our course webpage and click on electronic sectioning, and it walks you through the process. It's very easy. So that needs to be done on Wednesday or Thursday, before Thursday at midnight.
Just want to emphasize that it's really crucial to remember to section electronically Wednesday or Thursday. That's the only way we can include you in the section process, which is done by a central computer deep under a mountain in the Rockies and far beyond the control of mere humans like us. For those of you just coming in, there's a few more seats on the stairs and also in the seating area, especially here in the front. A couple questions that people have asked. One is about auditing the course. Can one audit? The answer is we don't know yet. It depends on how our enrollment is and how close we are to the size of this room, which seats 492. If we're filling the room with students registered for the class, then there won't be room for auditors. But another consideration is in past years, many students tell themselves, this looks like an amazing course. Speakers I'd like to get to know. I'll audit the course. And then life gets in the way, and one has 4 or 5 other courses, and one ends up auditing maybe one session. And so I would just encourage you to ask yourself, if this is a course that's useful to your life, do you want to take it or not? If you think that this course might be a life-changing experience for you, an energizing experience for you, do you really want to shortchange yourself by simply planning to audit it? Another question has been pass-fail, and you're welcome to take the course pass-fail if you wish. If you need a signature for that or anything else, you can catch me after class today or in office hours tomorrow, 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. in Barker 308. Again, that's tomorrow, 4 to 6. We have a course dinner, the first, on Wednesday, 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock in the Leverett House private dining room. You're all invited. It sounds like it will be unbearably crowded, but past experience shows that we usually find place for everyone, and if not, we can spill out into the larger dining hall as needed. I might also mention, for those of you concerned about the large size of the course, I've decided to expand a small seminar that I'm teaching, The Making of Human Sacredness, from 10 to 18 spots, and if anyone's interested in that, you can catch me afterwards. The source book for the course is now available at the Harvard Coop as of today, and as I mentioned last Wednesday, I recommend that you buy it or steal it together with a friend. It makes sense to share it with a friend, a roommate, someone else in the course, to save on the cost. I think that's all of the practical. Oh, yes, thanks. Do you want to?
We also need volunteers to ask questions of our guest for Wednesday, Swanee Hunt. Would anyone be interested in asking a question to Swanee Hunt? Great. There's one. Good.
More people to ask a question to Swanee Hunt.
Great. Good.
We need a few more. Swanee Hunt is, please, good.
Great. I will have a paper here in case anybody else wants to join for your email addresses after class.
At this point, it's an enormous pleasure to introduce this spring's first guest, Professor Cynthia Enloe. A political scientist, Enloe is the leading thinker in the field of feminist international relations theory. She is the author or editor of more than a dozen books, including the classic Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, Making Feminist Sense of International Politics. Her most recent book is called Maneuvers, The International Politics of Militarizing Women's Lives. We are fortunate to be able to start the term with a guest who brings such clear sense of purpose, not to mention courage, to her scholarly production. Please join me in welcoming Professor Cynthia Enloe.
It's a pleasure to be here in this intimate setting.
And as is our intimate practice, we will work from questions. And if I may take the liberty of asking the first one, Professor Enloe, if we were to go back to your own college years, to what extent would we find the seedlings of the concerns and the scholarly work that came later in your undergraduate days?
Well, that was 1890s. Actually, 1890s were pretty radical. I wasn't that radical. I grew up on Long Island. Anyone else from Long Island? Okay, I'm from Manhasset, right? Manhasset High School. And I went to Connecticut College down in New London when it was an all-women's college. And I think that had an impact. I deliberately chose an all-women's college. This would be, get this, in the 50s. But to tell you the truth, in the 1950s, and certainly, I think about this a lot now, certainly at Connecticut, but I think also from friends I've talked to of my own generation at other colleges, the word feminist was never uttered. We are at an all-women's college. We never, in any political science or history class or in any class, ever studied the women's suffrage movement, ever. I never heard the word suffrage mentioned in all my years at Connecticut, and yet I had professors who themselves would have been of a generation that were the first to vote. And I now think about, how did they get so silenced? And what was it like? We were all Republicans, all these undergraduates. I don't think the faculty was. And I think they must have thought we were really, I don't know, from outer space. I mean, they were very dedicated, but I I think the seedlings were there in the sense that I was amidst a lot of women faculty members. There were men too on the faculty, but I saw women who could be serious. And in the 1950s and the 1960s, to be serious and a woman was not an attractive combination. And I think that really had a huge impact on me. I didn't know the word feminism. I never heard it uttered. None of my friends talked about it. We didn't know that we were in between the first and second wave of American feminism. I mean, we were just Zippo in consciousness. But I think something seeped in there.
Thank you. We now have a question from Grace Willens.
Hi, Grace.
You talked a little about fruitful embarrassment and the humility necessary to stop trying to convince people that you know more than they do. How did you come to relax and allow yourself to be vulnerable and still feel secure enough in what you know that you aren't driven by the need to defend yourself?
Wow, Grace, this is great. This has come out of the conversation with Carol Cohn that I know some of you had access to. Carol, by the way, is great. She lives here in Boston, and she's a feminist who has probably had the greatest impact on our understanding about how men wield their masculinity with each other when they are nuclear weapons specialists. That's what Carol's own research is on. And she and I had this conversation. And I've had to work really, I mean, we all have to work really hard. I think the culture, the competitive culture, whether it's in academia or in athletics or entertainment, and especially, of course, in business, I think the culture encourages one to be defensive, right? It encourages one to sort of build a plexiglass shield in front of ourselves. I mean, certainly this has been my experience. You build a shield in front of yourself so you can't be touched, right? So that you never admit, oh my God, I didn't know that. Oh, that's totally new to me. Oh, I should have known that, I didn't. I should have expected that. To tell you the truth, I never even dreamed of that. And it's all the pressures are to say you knew even when you didn't know, for me to say that I think one of the things that I've learned from other feminists, because you never learn these things by yourself, right? I mean, without friends, I mean, we'd all be morons. And what I've learned from other people, other feminists especially, is that defensiveness makes you stupid. That it really, that plexiglass shield, that closes out knowledge, that closes out surprise, that closes out new understandings. But you have to learn it and learn it and learn it. And so when I work with a lot of graduate students, and one of the things that recently I've been trying to do is to do mock conference panels and to get people to be able to say when they're asked, and mind you, your credibility's on the line, and you're asked at the American Political Science Association, oh, Professor Enloe, did you know that? You know, something to do with the paper you just presented. And to have the kind of, not, well, confidence, but not arrogance. A kind of, like your word was really good, a kind of relaxed, meaning open, attitude towards knowledge that you can say, gosh, you know, that's new. Say a little more. No, I haven't thought of that. I need to think about that if I'm going to keep working on this. But it takes, I know, a lot of kind of, like you said, it's almost like a physical kind of relaxation, as well as a social and political relaxation. But it is, I think it is a part of learning. It's very hard, whether it be at Harvard or where I teach at Clark or at Berkeley where I was at graduate school. It takes a lot to constantly learn, which means to admit you don't know things. I think it's an ongoing process, and every pressure in the American culture, every pressure, especially in academic, business, professional cultures, every pressure will be that you will deny ignorance, right? So you have to have your antennae out all the time, and so that you hear, oh, the expectation now is that I'll pretend I knew that. And you almost have to hear that so that you can say something other. So you never You never stop learning this, particularly because in this culture, it's expected that your credibility depends on knowing everything all the time. And I think that makes you stupid, you know. So I'm fighting against my own stupidity, right? But it's a constant battle.
We're going to intersperse volunteered questions with spontaneous ones. At this point, a spontaneous question from someone brave.
Oh, you don't have to be brave. I mean, if this is bravery, oh my God. I mean, really? To ask a question amongst a bunch of classmates to this 5'2" person standing up front, this is not bravery. Hi.
Hi.
Tell me your name.
Alyssa.
Hi, Alyssa.
What do you think about what has happened to the word feminist? And is it even a useful word anymore because it has so many negative connotations?
I always say I'm a feminist now. I didn't. I mean, you know, it took me a long time. I was a little slow. I didn't start calling myself a feminist until, well, never during Berkeley. I was at Berkeley when Berkeley was Berkeley, right? And, yeah, well, don't cheer too much. There were no feminists when Berkeley was Berkeley, right? And so it was radical, but you know what? That meant it wasn't that radical because it didn't ask about patriarchy, right? And I never thought about it. I think it's really hard when we communicate with each other through a media, particularly a mainstream media, that wants to turn feminists and feminism into cartoons. And when that's the way we sort of like talk to each other, like through Fox or through, you know, the New York Times, when it's all filtered through that, it becomes really hard to figure out, well, what's it mean to be acting like a feminist? What does it mean to actually try to conduct one's life, no matter where one's conducting it, as a feminist? I think what's happening is that more and more women in the world, I mean, we're just a little pocket, you know, more and more women in the world are identifying themselves as feminists. So I work with women in South Korea, in Japan, in Turkey. This is now, I'm being very specific. These are groups of women I've been working with just in the last 12 months. Tokyo, Seoul, Istanbul, Izmir, also Turkey, Oslo, Kingston, Ontario, this just recently. And what's interesting there is that more and more women and some men, a lot of men who would at least identify themselves as feminist friendly because they're not sure whether it's proper to call themselves feminists. That's a very interesting discussion. But more and more women in all of those places where I've been recently, more are calling themselves feminists than did even 6 years ago, 10 years ago. So in the United States context, I think there is a lot, it feels brave to call yourself a feminist. Why should it feel brave to say that I believe that sexism sets back the development of American culture? Like, why should it be brave to say that sexism is not good for building a healthy society? It shouldn't feel brave to call oneself a feminist. And by the way, there's no sort of cookie cutter definition of what a feminist is. I have a couple of things in my mind that I realize I now use as kind of criteria. I don't mean that you all should. You should discuss it amongst yourselves. One is that I believe one of the first things about being a feminist, or one of the first things I had to learn, and by the way, nobody at Radical Berkeley told me I should do this, so other people had to teach me. One of the first things is I've learned that to take women's ideas and women's experiences seriously in order to make sense of the world. That to me is like one of the bottom lines of being a feminist. To actually take seriously women's ideas and women's experiences, to take seriously. There's the weighty word. There's the political word. To take seriously women's lives and women's experiences in order to make sense not just of women's lives but of the world. And out of that, then to ask, to what extent do the operations of masculinized privilege and sexism set back not only women, but whole societies. So for me, I mean, those seem like, I mean, is that very brave? You know, I don't know. Maybe it is. I mean, when I the first time I ever felt brave, this is like, on the scale of bravery, I mean, this is like so far down, right? So it just shows, you know, what thresholds are like. I remember the first time I wrote a book, I wrote about 6, this is embarrassing, I wrote about 6 books before I woke up to asking feminist questions. And then I finally, you know, saw the light, and I began being curious about women's lives in order to explain militarism. And I wrote a book, this is back in the 80s, and, you know, where I felt really as if I were taking a risk. This is really bad. When I decided to write an entire chapter in a book, now here I am trying to get tenure as a political scientist, okay? Not a sociologist, not an anthropologist, a political scientist. I decided to put in a whole chapter on military wives. Nobody in political science in the 1980s thought that a group of people on the planet called wives were interesting political subjects. That is, should be taken seriously. And that's when I felt brave. I mean, this is pathetic, right? But so that, to me, was one of the first kind of academic feminist steps I ever took, right? So it's a great question, but it's an ongoing discussion, and one needs to talk about it across cultures, across classes, across countries. But I think more and more women are calling themselves feminists. That's certainly true in Turkey. It's certainly true in Japan. It's certainly true in Korea, all of which have very lively feminist movements now.
Sarah Spofford has a question for us.
Sarah, hi. You guys have good questions. Be sure and ask these questions of every speaker, including Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky. Really, ask Noam Chomsky what he's learned from feminism. He sits on the stage with feminists almost once a week. So ask him. Shh. Yeah.
Hi. You talk with Carol Cohn about the advantages of being underestimated as a, quote, naive little lady. Yeah. And I was wondering, at what point in your life you really felt like you were no longer seen that way?
That's great. Yeah, Carol and I, we were, by the way, this interview, you have to picture, this interview was in her kitchen, right? You know, where all serious conversations go on. And one of the reasons it came up is because Carol, who has written this now classic, I think it's been published in 25 languages, article describing what it was like to be one of the few women, and at that point she was a very young woman, probably thought of by the others as a girl, amongst nuclear strategists at MIT and the Army War College and other places. And she said one of the reasons that she came up with such an amazing assortment of revelations about how these masculinized, not just because they were men, masculinized nuclear strategists, they were all civilians. One of the reasons she came up with such revelations about how they denied that they were working on weapons that killed people, that's one of the things she found, was because they would talk so openly with her because, I mean, she was a girl. I mean, who cares? You can say anything you want, you know, in front of a girl. And in exchange, I said, well, one of the first bits of research I did was before I was a feminist, was my Ph.D. dissertation in Malaysia. And I was looking at ethnic politics and education policy, which is very, very salient in Malaysian life. And a lot of civil servants who otherwise were very guarded, and a lot of political party leaders, all men, were very careful with their words. A lot of the reasons they said very indiscreet things in my presence is because, I mean, I was there in picture this, in a sleeveless, you know, dress and sandals, and I don't think my hair was even curly then, but, you know, I was definitely a girl in their eyes. And so then your question's a really good one. So should one sort of market that kind of feminized naivete? Because, of course, it feeds patriarchy, doesn't it? right? It's a very dangerous thing to think is an advantage in one's professional development. Because, yeah, Carol and I may have had things said to us that were very politically indiscreet because we came across as sort of naive in the most feminized version of naive. But what were we feeding? What did we reinforce by playing those roles? Not a good thing to build a new society on, wherever that society is. So I think your question really has the answer embedded in it, Sarah, and I think it's a really good one. That is, whatever, and I think a lot of African American anti-racist activists have been far ahead of us on this, and a lot of Asian American activists have also taught us, be careful what images in the eyes of others you allow to go unchallenged, even if at the moment those seem to give you some advantage. Beware. I don't think I would do that again. I don't think I would do that again. But it's tempting sometimes, you know. It's tempting, which is why this course is so interesting around commitment, because you can't tell whether you're committed unless you can tell when you're tempted. If you can't notice you're tempted, you'll never notice whether you've got commitment, right? So it's still tempting. It's still tempting to sort of, I mean, I have a harder time in my current form I don't wear sleeveless, you know, sundresses anymore. But there are lots of times when you can come across as somebody who's naive. But for a woman, because naivete is so feminized. In fact, any male who is characterized as naive, imagine Rumsfeld making a joke about Powell. You can feminize anyone. And one of the ways men feminize other men in order to discredit them is to portray them as naive, because naivete is so closely wedded to femininity. And naivete and femininity are so intimately engaged with each other in so many societies. So it's a dangerous game. I try really hard not to let it go unchallenged now. But it's tempting. Thanks, Sarah. That's really good.
We'll take another spontaneous question. Yep.
Hi.
Hi. Based on the
Just tell me your name.
Joe.
Hi, Joe.
Based on the extraordinary increase and expansion of women's rights and freedoms in both Afghanistan and in Iraq, on those grounds, do you support Bush's military intervention?
Let's start with the first part, and let's just start. Well, no, because it's really Joe's question's a good one, but let's take it in two parts. And let's take each country, right? Because Afghanistan and Iraq have really different gendered histories. There's really different gendered politics in the histories of those two countries. So Iraq, Afghanistan is not one word, right? They are really two countries with two kinds of gendered political histories. Let's just take Iraq for a minute. One of the things that is so interesting, and it's hard to find this in the mainstream media, but you can find it on the electronic news service called eWoman, or maybe it's eWomen, but it's small e, W, capital W, O, M, E, N, or A, N. I think it's probably E, N. And there are a lot of news stories now coming out through alternative media of what's been happening to women's organizing in Iraq. There's a lot of women's organizing in Iraq, and in fact, when Swani's here next week, be sure and ask her about women's organizing in Iraq, right? Because she's one of the people who've been trying to encourage those women who are organizing. There's a lot of women's organizing going on in Iraq. she's been trying to encourage those women to be in touch with women in other countries to share strategies and so on. So ask Swani. But one of the things that they've been saying, Joe, is that they have absolutely, these are all autonomous women's groups, they have absolutely no nostalgia for the Ba'athist regime, all right? But they said one of the things that they want to take from the Ba'athist era, of course the Ba'ath party is Saddam Hussein's party, one of the things they want to take from the Ba'athist era is they want to take the secularization of government. The secularization of government is one of the hallmarks of the Ba'athist party ideology. It's one of the reasons why a lot of governments around the Middle East hated the Saddam Hussein regime, hated the Ba'athist regime, because it was founded on secularism. And so what a number of these women's groups say, though, is that the new Iraqi governing council that was appointed by Bremer and by the Bush administration, that 25-member governing council, which is now the Iraqi equivalent of a transition government, it has just, last month, it passed the most sweeping, with no public discussion, the most sweeping decision. It said that it would not reinstitute, it would institute for the first time, because it didn't exist under the Ba'athist regime, the Sharia law as governing law. And that in fact, would introduce to Iraq, for the first time in the last 40 years, laws that restricted women's rights for divorce, restricted women's access to education, restricted women's roles in court proceedings. And there's now pressure on from the women's groups in Iraq to not let Bremer and the Occupation Authority sign off on that. So it's a really contested kind of politics going on now in Iraq, precisely because, I think, precisely because the Bush administration did not actually think through gender politics. They thought through a gender slogan. That is, the liberation of women was a justification for a military invasion. But they did not think through a gender political platform and a program of implementation. So they've been caught completely off guard by this. In Afghanistan, there's also a lot of women's organizing. Now, Afghanistan also has had a very tumultuous constitutional history since the 1960s. It's had one constitution in the 1960s that now a lot of Afghan women's advocates, whether they call themselves feminists or not, want to reinstitute as the basis of the new constitution, because that constitution really was created a secular government for Afghanistan, and also instituted in it, this is 1960s Afghanistan, by the way, instituted within it guarantees of women's education, women's rights to property, women's rights to divorce, women's equality in voting and in court proceedings. These are all crucial. You don't have equal status in court proceedings, then your marriage is slavery. Right? So court proceedings and the nitty-gritty of court proceedings, that really matters to women, because so much of marriage is legalized, is turned into legal judicial proceedings. Afghanistan has just had the Loya Jirga to create the new constitution. Women met ahead of time. They had a whole agenda. Out of the 600 members of the Loya Jirga, 200 were women. That is a very big step forward. They pushed for it. They organized for it. It was not a gift from the Potomac. And a lot of them say they didn't get anywhere near what they wanted in the new Constitution. The new Constitution now has 2 provisions. And the question will become, how are they balanced in actual law and in implementation? The first, probably you've been following this, some of you. The first provision in the new Afghan Constitution says that women and men will be seen as equal in the state. The second provision says that all Afghan state law will be designed to be compatible with Islamic law. Now the question is, there are Quranic feminists, right? Are they going to be on the Supreme Judicial Court of Afghanistan? That is, who's going to interpret what is Islamic law? So in Afghanistan, the constitutional process is further ahead. There is a model from the past of what a lot of Afghan women want. A lot of Afghan women are organizing. Now keep posted. What's happened with the media is that there was a lot of coverage of the Constitutional Convention. There were only 2 reporters that covered the pre-Constitutional Convention women's organizing. That's the only reason I know what their agenda was. But now all the cameras have left, all the newspapers have pulled out their reporters, and so now we're not going to find out what happens with the post-Constitutional Convention constitutional politics. But now is when real politics begin. So I don't see the Bush administration's rhetoric of women's liberation as justifying preemptive military occupation as very credible, because it was not based on any kind of occupation planning. And I think it's run into real surprises for those who really did, in the administration, who really did have that as part of their hope, because they didn't plan for it. They didn't think it through. Sorry, it's a very long answer, but it's very important. Very important.
Sarah Dickinson has a question.
Hi there.
So you talked in your article about protecting your own line of thinking from popular, crafted diversionary narratives. Do you think this is necessary for any kind of independent thought? And how did you learn to do this in your own life?
You know, part of what I've sort of come to learn, I haven't learned it enough yet, but one of the things I've come to learn over the years is how you tell the story is going to dictate what you think the meaning is. Storytellers are really powerful, right? Whether they be media storytellers or legislators acting as storytellers or movie makers acting as storytellers, it's very powerful. And this is one of the great breakthroughs, I think, of recent feminist work on narrative. This is why a lot of the feminism that's going on in literary theory, although sometimes the language doesn't mobilize you, but in fact has really a kernel of very important truth in it. It's taught us to really listen to how stories are told, and I now find myself watching how other people tell stories and trying as far as to protect myself from it. I almost never can do it by myself. I mean, absolutely not. I mean, one of the things one depends on, whether you call yourself a feminist or not, you depend on always having lots of colleagues and friends that will be honest with you and ask you, well, why'd you leave that out? Why'd you stop the story there? You began telling, let's take the politics of women in Afghanistan. You began telling it in the 1960s. How come you didn't start in the 1940s? It really depends so much on having people who trust you and you trust them enough that they will challenge you on how you're telling the story or what story you're accepting. You can't do it alone. You just can't do it alone. You have to have a diverse enough and honest enough and lively enough group of acquaintances. They don't have to be all your best buddies, but acquaintances and colleagues so that they will keep challenging you, helping you to understand something anew. But it is very easy in this media-driven era to adopt somebody else's storyline, and then once you've adopted that storyline, you can't even imagine a different causality. Right? Storylines, are some of you doing filmmaking or doing, communications, yeah. Storylines have within them an argument about causality. That's why it's so risky. That's why whoever gets to tell the story has a lot of power. You need a lot of storytellers, not just one. And when you realize you're telling a story in a way that leads to only one conclusion, make sure that people have a chance to write in your margins or ask you awkward questions. So that's why that's one of the new things I've learned from other feminists. Is that kind of what you were getting at? Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah. You're the controller of the airspace. Right over there on the aisle.
My name is my name is Blake.
Hi,
And I was
Blake.
wondering if you could talk about your conceptions of womanhood and femininity as and the role of feminism as they apply to the transgendered community.
Right. In the more recent decade, there has been a lot more discussion about sexuality, identity, and politics. This is, I wouldn't say it's not brand new, but it's new to be so broadly talked about. The discussion of sexuality and femininity, sexuality and sexism, sexuality and the privileging of certain kinds of masculinities, that's of longer standing, right? But I think what we're all coming to a newer understanding is that sexuality itself is much more fluid than any of us thought. Now, on the one hand, it doesn't mean that when somebody condescendingly says to you, oh, it's just a phase, right? Because that's the condescending version of sexuality is fluid. Right? But I think we are beginning to understand that sexuality has to be talked about as a basis for identity, not just a basis for behavior, but a basis for identity. Now, what feminists bring into that is don't leave out masculinity and femininity when you talk about sexuality. That is, and this is now in my own sort of understanding, but I'm still developing here my own ideas, that is that I don't think queer politics by itself, without being informed with what we've learned from feminism and feminists, I don't think queer politics without being informed by feminist experience and feminist ideas, I don't think it's enough. Because one of the things that happens if one just talks about, say, for instance, transgender politics, and doesn't ask, well, where is the privileging of which kinds of masculinity? Where is the privileging of certain kinds of femininities as subordinate to certain kinds of masculinities? Where are they? And the most interesting kinds of gay and lesbian and transgender bisexual politics today are those that, in fact, always ask about which kinds of masculinity are getting privileged for the sake of subordinating which kinds of femininities. And those questions have to always be asked. So, for instance, this is now just sort of a branch off your question a little bit here. Take the debate right after Clinton's first election in 1992, and this was the debate about gays in the military. And a lot of us became very nervous, well, nervous for a couple of reasons, but I'll just pick one reason now. We became very nervous about the way that debate, this has to do with narrative, the way that debate played itself out in the U.S. Congress and the U.S. media in the winter and spring of 1993. Because gay men and lesbians got collapsed into gays in the military. But gay men's relationship to the U.S. military and lesbian women's relationship to the U.S. military is not the same. A lesbian, or a woman who is imagined by somebody else in her unit or in her command to be a lesbian, in fact, is going to have charges of outing as a lesbian wielded over her in the name of trying to exclude all women from the military. Lesbian behavior in the military, in fact, fits the military too well in its stereotypic form, whereas the stereotype of gay men in the military is at odds with the military. And one of the things we got very nervous about, a lot of us that were involved in this politics, very complicated politics, in the spring of '93, is that gay men and lesbians were collapsed into gays in the military, and then all the debate, in fact, was all about masculinity. The debate was not about lesbians in the military, even though per capita a higher percentage of women are dishonorably discharged from the U.S. military on the basis of being lesbians than are men for being allegedly gay men. So the reality and the rhetoric were so far apart, but it comes back, I think, to one of the things that we've learned from that is, and we've learned in many countries as well, is that to talk about sexuality, identity, and politics isn't an alternative to continuing to explore sort of feminist understandings of how that power works. That's not a full answer to your question, but to start.
We have time for a couple more questions, and we'll take the first of those from Jessica Tang.
Hey, Jessica.
Where's Jessica? One
Hi.
second.
You guys are great.
At the end of the Signs article, you talk about the necessity of crafting and teaching others to craft a feminist curiosity.
Well, slow down, Jessica. Sorry.
Well, I was wondering if you could expand upon that, what you meant by that, and also how you think that we can do this, and what that was crafting and teaching others to craft a feminist curiosity.
Thanks. That's great. Yeah, you you come to things slowly. I mean, I'm a teaching type, right? I've been teaching for a long time. I love teaching, and I think teaching is political. I don't mean by that it's ideological. I mean, I think that teaching is about power and learning about power. And over the years, what I've realized is that one of the hardest things for any of us to do, including people called faculty members, but as well as people called students, one of the hardest things to do is to become curious about something you didn't used to be curious about. Right? I mean, do you all watch yourself when you walk through a bookstore or when you flip through whatever daily paper you read? Do you watch when you pause and when you just keep walking? I mean, when I go into Wordsworth, one of my favorite bookstores, when I go into Wordsworth or any other big bookstore, or when I'm reading the New York Times, I watch what I flip over, right? And what I pause at. And that's really me sort of trying to monitor my own curiosity. I've got a lot of friends who are very knowledgeable about, active in, teach, write about the environment. And they've always got to get me to slow down, pay more attention to environmental subjects, environmental news. And so to become curious as a feminist and to craft, that really means to craft it for yourself. To craft a feminist curiosity means to craft a way of asking about things you never asked about. So that when you hear on a British Airways flight, as a friend of mine did who was just flying to Nairobi, she heard the captain come on and introduce herself on the transatlantic BA flight. And she said, I wonder what it took to become a woman transatlantic. That's, the top of the ladder there. Transatlantic British Airways pilot. She wouldn't have asked that question. And nobody else in the cabin seemed to ask it. She asked the flight attendant. Because here's the opposite. Things that one's not curious about, one takes as given. Things that one is not curious about, one takes as normal, as inevitable, as insignificant. Let me do that again. Things, and this is me too, things that any of us are not curious about means that if being not curious means we take it as normal, inevitable, or insignificant. That is making a big political statement about that thing. Anything that we, by our silence, by not being curious about it, by flipping the page, by walking past that part of the bookstore, that means that we, or the fourth is, we think it's somebody else's business. Oh yeah, it's kind of interesting, but somebody else will take care of it. Well, those are very political statements we're making. And one of the things that had to happen in my own belated development of a political curiosity was to change my definition of what's political. I was taught at Berkeley, just like people were taught at every other graduate program in political science, and most places still are, that what goes on inside things called homes is what sociologists study. That's not political. So what does that mean you're not curious about? Wielding of power, then, one is not curious about, and the people who are teaching that what goes on inside a quote-unquote home is not political, and therefore not the subject of a political scientist's curiosity. What are you letting go as normal, inevitable, insignificant, or somebody else can deal with it? Violence. One of the hardest things to do in every country and in every political organization is to get masculinized violence against women to be seen as political. The domestic violence battered women campaign, when do you think that started in the United States? We're now in 2003. Women won the vote in 1920. The suffrage movement started in about 1860. Women were written out of the Constitution of the United States in 1789. Those are some benchmarks. So when do you think domestic violence were put together as a term and argued to be a part of political life? When do you think? In the United States. Just take the United States. Where would you guess? When would you guess? 1990s. Or 1890s. Do you mean 1890s or 1990s? 1990s. Okay, think of any shelter. Think of any law. Think of the first time you heard of somebody being able to get a court injunction. You think it was just 1990s? What do you think? About around 94? Around 94? Yeah, what do you think? That's right. I mean, we're not there yet, right? Because it's still defined as private if it's between people of the same sex. Although there's now a movement to develop campaigns against same-sex violence. In the United States, it began around 1975.